So today we're going to talk about this one guy who had the huge job of trying to put an entire continent back together after it had been completely torn apart by war.
I mean, can you imagine? That was the exact problem facing European leaders over 200 years ago. Their whole world had been turned completely upside down for years, and they were just desperate to find a way to make the peace stick for good. All right, so to really get what they came up with, you have to understand the problem they were dealing with. And believe me, it was a big one. And that problem, well, it had a name: Napoleon Bonaparte. I mean, for more than 10 years, this guy, a super smart but incredibly ambitious French general, just dragged Europe into one war after another. He literally redrew the map, kicked out old kings, and put his own family in charge instead. So by the time he was finally beaten, Europe was an absolute mess. So, with Napoleon gone, all the big shots, the leaders of Europe, got together for this massive meeting. It was called the Congress of Vienna. And their job? Basically, to clean up all the chaos. And the guy who was pretty much running the show was this really calm, super clever Austrian diplomat named Klemens von Metternich. You see, Metternich, he'd seen the chaos of the French Revolution firsthand when he was younger, and it left a huge impression on him. It convinced him of one thing: sudden, radical change, super dangerous. He was convinced that the only way to keep things peaceful and stable was to stick with the old-school monarchies. So his goal wasn't really to punish France. No, it was to build a whole new system to make sure another Napoleon could never, ever happen again. So, what was his plan? Well, Metternich came up with this really smart two-part strategy to not just rebuild Europe, but to keep it stable for a long, long time. Okay, part one was all about something called legitimacy. Now, that's just a fancy word, right? All it really means is that the legitimate, or the rightful, royal families who Napoleon had kicked out should be put right back on their thrones. For Metternich, this was like hitting a giant reset button on Europe, just wiping away Napoleon's changes and putting the old rulers back where they belonged. Then came part two, and honestly, this is the really critical part. He wanted to create a balance of power. The whole idea here was to make sure that none of the major countries, they called them the great powers, could get so strong that it could dominate everybody else. They wanted to make sure they were all pretty much equal in strength, so no one could just bully the entire continent, like France had just done. And they didn't just hope this would happen, they engineered it. This was not random at all. They really carefully carved up and handed out pieces of land to make sure this balance worked. So you see Austria and Prussia getting stronger to act as barriers. Great Britain locks down its power over the seas. And Russia, well, it gets a little something, but it's also kind of boxed in so it can't get too powerful. It was seriously like a giant strategic game of Risk, except, with actual countries and people. And the last piece of this whole puzzle was a system they called the Concert of Europe. And you can think of it just like an orchestra. The idea was that all the great powers had to play together in harmony. So instead of immediately going to war, they agreed to meet up regularly and actually talk through their problems. And Metternich, you can bet he saw himself as the conductor of the whole thing. Okay, so this all sounds pretty good, right? Peace, stability, but there was a huge catch, a really big one. For Metternich's perfectly ordered system to actually work, he basically had to stop the future in its tracks. He had to crush any and all new ideas that challenged the old way of doing things. So you've got this clash happening. On one side, you have Metternich's world, all about tradition, kings and queens, and strict order. But bubbling up on the other side were these two new, really powerful ideas. The first was liberalism. This is the idea that people should have basic rights, like free speech, and get a say in how they're governed. The second was nationalism, the belief that people who share a language and a culture should get to have their own country. For a guy like Metternich, these ideas weren't just new, they were terrifying. They were pure chaos. So what do you do if you're Metternich and you want to stop these ideas? Well, you build a system of total control. He had government censors banning books and newspapers. He set up a secret police to spy on regular people. He even had spies in the universities, watching students and firing professors who taught anything he considered dangerous. The whole goal was to stamp out these new ideas before they could even take root. And you know what? For more than 30 years, Metternich's system, it kind of worked. There were no huge wars that engulfed the whole continent. But here's the thing, you can't just press pause on the future forever. All that pressure for change, it just kept building and building right under the surface. It was like a volcano just waiting to erupt. At first, the cracks were pretty small. In the 1820s, you see some revolts pop up in Spain and Italy. Then it gets a little bigger when the Greeks fight a whole war for their independence. By the 1830s, even the great powers, The guys who were supposed to be in the concert started arguing among themselves. And then, in 1848, the whole system just completely exploded.
Yeah, 1848 was the year that revolutions just swept across Europe like a wildfire. And this time, the angry crowds came for the guy who built the whole system, Metternich himself. Right there in Vienna, huge crowds of students and workers flooded the streets, demanding he step down. And just like that, the man who had basically controlled Europe for a generation had to resign and sneak out of the city in a disguise. His time was up.
So when we look back, what's his legacy? What should we make of this guy? Well, it's complicated. On the one hand, his system, the Concert of Europe, it gets credit for preventing a massive all-out war between the big powers for 99 years. Think about that. 99 years. From the end of Napoleon all the way to the start of World War I. That is an incredible achievement. It meant that for almost a century, people didn't have to experience the kind of devastation their parents and grandparents did. But, and it's a big but, that long period of peace came at a really high price. It was a peace that was enforced with secret police, with censorship, and by crushing the dreams of millions of people who just wanted basic freedoms or a country to call their own. Which leaves us with a big question to chew on, right? Was Metternich a brilliant peacemaker who saved Europe from itself? Or was he an enemy of progress who just held back the tide of history for as long as he could?